Thanks, Jessica. Now, today we are discussing the relationship that different governments have around the world with blockchain technology. And joining us to provide their expert opinion on the topic is Jason Fernandes and Edward Iskra. Hi, both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Absolutely, always a pleasure. Now, I think we should just jump straight in because we have quite an interesting topic with us. So governments are moving into blockchain technology into a variety of ways. So what are some specific use cases which can help municipal services? So Edward, would you want to start for us, please?
Sure. I mean, open ledger technology and blockchains are useful anytime and anywhere you want to be able to share information with different parties who don't necessarily trust each other, but want to be able to get information from a shared place that they can both trust. And there's lots of that in municipal technologies. Everything from land ownership, title records. Here in the United States, when you buy a piece of property, even a small house, you end up paying over thousands of dollars for things like title insurance, just to ensure that you have clear title, clear ownership of the property that you're buying, because you don't know if the person selling it to you has clear ownership of the property. That's the kind of thing which, if it were on a ledger that's openly accessible, could make life a lot simpler and save a lot of expense of looking things up. But of course, you have the problem that you can't look up titles on a ledger until titles are on a ledger. So you need to get the process started by getting information into the system, which is, sort of the genesis problem for municipal services. And it could go for things like checking whether you paid your licensing to have the garbage collection, or you're paying for your water fees. It could be whether you've paid your taxes. It could be whether you have a properly licensed carpenter or plumber working at your house. All sorts of information could be looked up and could be verified and maintained on blockchain once the system's there to do the lookups. The big problem is going to be getting information into the system. So it's vital to start projects that get information into the system and to have places in the world that do the early experimentation with getting things online and into blockchains so that these systems can start being broadly used.
Okay, sure, I see. And Jason, where do you stand on this?
So I think most of the blockchain's influence in the public sector will be behind the scenes for the next few years, but it has the potential to bring security, efficiency, and speed to a wide range of services and processes. The number one use case right now is digital currency and payments. Number two would be, as far as government is concerned, would be land registration, as Edward pointed out. The third is voting. We've had major problems with voting in cities in the United States, for example. Then you have identity management is a really big thing because blockchain is really useful for things like KYC. Finally, you have the things like supply chain traceability, healthcare, and corporate registration. So, for example, Delaware is experimenting with corporate registrations of companies on the blockchain. So the use of government, blockchain in a government context has grown tremendously. So like just 3 years ago, there was almost no headway in this area. But today you have agencies in more than a dozen countries. That includes Canada, the United Kingdom, Brazil, China, India, and they're all running pilots, tests, and trials. And they're both looking at the architecture's utility as a basis for government services, but also the procurement and development of individual blockchain-based applications for their own internal government use. So I think it's really exploding right now.
Absolutely, and we are really seeing more governments getting involved in this around the world. And you have actually just mentioned some really important use cases there, but blockchain technology has been seen as a buzzword with very few practical purposes for day-to-day business operations. So is it just a word with no actions in the government as well? What do you think? Do you want to take it away, Edward? What do you think?
Well, of course, it's going to be a buzzword so that people can get the buzz out there so that people realize there's a technology to be adopted. That's inevitable, but that doesn't mean there isn't actual implementation happening. There are lots of public-private partnerships. There are lots of partnerships between governments and institutions of education. And these kinds of things are necessary to get things started. And as Jay mentioned, there are a lot of pilot projects out there where people are already actively doing things like publishing, licensing on blockchains, looking at supply chains. Supply chain is a huge area for crypto because people at all ends of the supply chain want to be able to verify that things are transferring as expected and as, timely as expected. But, end users, consumers have never had access to the supply chain. It's one thing to be able to get a piece of produce at a supermarket and see on the package that it says it came from someplace. It's another entirely to be able to scan a QR code and see the provenance of that, to see where it came from and how it got to where it is. And these are beginning to exist in the real world. There are people managing these things in real places now.
And Jason, I can see you nodding just there. Do you also agree that it's a lot more than just a buzzword?
Yeah, I agree with Edward on that. I mean, blockchain does have several practical use cases in business operations. There are plenty of companies doing really interesting work. But specifically with government, there is quite a bit of movement. Like the UAE, for example, are looking into business registration, trade, and central bank operations. Estonia, which is widely thought of as a leader in tech literacy and e-services, they're piloting blockchain-based solutions for voting, identity management, and healthcare. Like I was mentioning earlier, in the U.S., Delaware is one of the major states to incorporate a company, and Delaware is piloting a blockchain-based corporate registry system. In addition to exploring share issuance, which was recently affirmed in July 2017, via passage of the state legislation where they approved trade and maintenance of corporate stock on the blockchain. So that's one of the use cases. But also elsewhere in the U.S., you have several federal agencies, including the General Services Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, and they've all essentially announced blockchain programs. So in New York, Illinois, and Texas, they are currently piloting and/or testing blockchain applications. And in all these cases, blockchain has a potential to create value, regardless of the type of asset or transaction involved.
Okay, sure. And also, blockchain technology is seen as cutting costs and overheads for government. So that is really quite important. But how difficult will it be to onboard these technologies? Jason, do you want to take it away for us?
Sure. There will be some teething issues. One of the big ones is a shortage of qualified blockchain programmers. So that's been a problem that's slowly starting to fill out. I mean, as more programmers start turning to blockchain, but there's also problems of scalability. So we notice that a lot of blockchains are not really able to scale very easily without major issues. But I think by far the greatest may be stubbornness. Government is not known for being on the cutting edge, and there's a tendency to look at new technology with suspicion. Blockchain, especially because of crypto scams, etc., it has this whiff of criminality, which blockchain would really have to shrug off if it has to be successful in a government context.
And Edward, please hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. I do think it's important to remember that every new technology has this kind of curve. Initially there are a few people who know how to use it. I imagine if we all went to a restaurant after this interview and we wanted to look up what restaurant to go to and how to get there, we would look it up on our phones and we wouldn't think about the fact that the lookups happened on the internet, that we just accessed a database system that has web pages with all these places on it, and we looked up a mapping system that's going to give us directions. And all that was impossible 20 years ago because you didn't have the internet, you didn't have the mapping systems, and you didn't have the ability to do any of this on the phone. But now it's all second nature. So I think a lot of it, the only piece of the puzzle that Jay, I don't think, touched on is the user interface, the accessibility of this. Because for now, you need blockchain engineers who know exactly what they're doing. But as we have open standards for these things, as we have more people doing things at different parts of this ecosystem, you'll have less need for the specific blockchain knowledge and more just the ability to work with the technology. Just as today, people have simple tools for making websites and designers don't have to know how to handle a web server, eventually people won't need to know how to work with blockchain in order to use these services on blockchain. Just as one quick example, Malta is currently working on getting all sorts of diplomas and certifications online. I believe they're working with a company that's using BlockCerts, and BlockCerts is an open standard that was developed by MIT, who also is putting all their diplomas online. Now, an open standard that's usable around the world, well, that sounds like the hypertext transfer protocol, the thing that uses that underlies the entire World Wide Web. Now, you don't ever have to think about the fact that HTTP is underlying every website you look at. You just use them. So once we get past the learning curves and the user interface becomes simple and usable, it'll become much more accessible to everyone.
And you have actually just touched on my next question, but let's definitely get some more information on this. Jason, will governments have to court distributed ledger engineers in order to onboard stable blockchain systems into their municipal services? Sorry.
So I think probably the smartest way to tackle that problem is for government to partner with the private sector. Like Edward was just talking about Malta partnering with the learning machine on Block Cert, on implementing Block Cert. I think the idea of which was obviously to put degrees on the blockchain so anybody can access them and be assured of its integrity. Essentially, the more that governments start partnering with private companies and the private sector, the easier this problem will be to solve. But also in Malta, in the case of Malta, it was an announcement recently that the University of Malta would also introduce a blockchain to some of its courses from October. So law courses, ICT, engineering, and related subjects will be changed and have some credits focused on blockchain. So that means you'll have lawyers that also specialize in this industry, accountants, auditors, ICT officials, programmers, etc. So we'll start seeing both from a university level, people qualified individuals that are able to take this up, but also you'll find a lot of private sector companies that are really excelling in whatever particular use case that that particular government is looking to implement, and it would probably be in their best interest to just partner with the current private sector.
Okay, sure. And Edward, where do you stand? Do you sort of agree on everything that Jason just said? Yeah.
I agree entirely. Jay's right on target. For now, there might be an uphill battle for the first movers who want to sort of acquire the technologists who are good in this space. But the big thing is that the technologists who are working in this space are very much about open standards and open technologies. So that helps keep the information spread out. What's really going to happen is that when a government becomes known as being a hotbed of this kind of activity, the companies will be also looking to engage with those governments. Countries will be looking to get contracts to support these governments, and it'll become sort of the same thing as the what we call the Chinese restaurant effect. You know, there's a part of the city that you go to if you want to have Chinese food. It's not because there's one Chinese restaurant, it's because there's several. They all end up there because that's where you go for Chinese food. The same thing is going to be happening with governments and with cryptocurrency-based companies, blockchain-based companies. They'll become known as the kinds of places you go for these sorts of services, or the kinds of countries you go to establish these kinds of services.
Absolutely. And Malta is one of those countries because Malta is leading the way with the adoption of blockchain technology. So, Edward, can you just sort of give us some more information about what kind of benefits that it has revealed?
Well, for one thing, it's putting Malta on the map. I can say that I work in the cryptocurrency industry, and there's a lot of discussion of Malta. Normally in the tech industry, you'd hear lots of talk about, the known high-tech places of the world, including Silicon Valley. That's sort of the place a lot of technology comes from. But in the crypto space, you're hearing a lot about a few specific places in the world, and one of them is Malta. If that weren't happening, I would say that maybe Malta's efforts aren't paying off, but they are paying off because we know that Malta is there. We know about the large conferences being held. When you do a lookup of Malta and crypto on the web, you hear about Blockchain Island. So the awareness is out there, and it's getting out to beyond the crypto space. CNBC calls Malta Blockchain Island. You see articles in Forbes about Malta and all the things they're doing. So it is happening in terms of the public perception, and it's going to be difficult for me to judge how effective it is in terms of paying off real life utility in Malta, but that's going to become obvious to people who visit Malta and to people who live and work in Malta in very short order.
Absolutely, and it really is, as you say, becoming known as the blockchain island. Now, as we've mentioned, Malta is doing incredible in that way. But what about countries that aren't? And so, what kind of challenges are these countries facing when they're trying to bring blockchain technology into their services? Jason, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think a few of the we did cover some of the challenges, but I think the major ones would be scalability, energy consumption, and privacy. So with regard to scalability, we've seen blockchains have trouble effectively supporting a large number of users. So both Bitcoin and Ethereum, the leading blockchain networks have experienced slow transaction speeds, higher fees per transaction as a result of substantial increase in users. So obviously, this would be a huge problem when you get into government use cases. Another would be essentially the energy consumption. So, for example, the majority of blockchains use proof of work to achieve consensus. And essentially what that is it involves using computational power of a computer to solve complex mathematical equations in order to verify the transaction and to add it to the blockchain. And it works well, but it does consume a lot of energy. So, for example, we know that Bitcoin blockchain consumes something like 0.2% of all global electricity this year. And we've also seen that the energy is equivalent to the entire usage of the country of Bulgaria. So energy concerns are really huge, and particularly if you have to scale this, that becomes an even bigger problem. Finally, you have things like privacy. So the concept of like Bitcoin blockchain, for example, is designed to be publicly visible. And all the information pertaining to any transactions available for anybody to view. So, with the exception of certain privacy-centric coins, this is the same for many blockchains currently, and that might be of some importance in some contexts, but it's a liability if you start talking about using distributed ledgers in the context of sensitive environments. So, for example, private patient data should not be available for everybody to see. But also, like when you're referring to government use cases, privacy can be increasingly important. And for blockchain to be really adopted on a wide scale, the ledgers will need to be altered in order to limit access to data contained only to those that have necessary clearance. So this is probably one of the major problems that I would see if you're looking at large-scale adoption. On the plus hand, though, most of these challenges, or all these challenges, are not really unique to government. So government will end up benefiting from the private sector working on these solutions for themselves, and government will end up benefiting almost by extension. So which goes back to why I was saying it sort of makes more sense for government to partner with the private sector, because they have more of an interest to actually start pushing this and trying to solve some of these real problems.
And a really in-depth analysis you've just given us there, so thank you very much for that. So, Edward, is there anything else that you think Jason might have missed, or it would just be great to hear what you think some of the challenges are for countries getting involved with blockchain technology?
Jay went very broad on the challenges, and he did an excellent job of covering them. The two things that I would add is one is the development of user interfaces that makes this simple and easy to use for everyone. So that's going to be a key thing, because like the internet and the mobile phone technologies, it needs to be transparent to people who use it, on top of being secure and controlled and accessible. On the technological front, though, I'm an optimist. I see a lot of the work that's going on, and I believe we're going forwards on every one of these fronts. I would also mention that I'm an optimist on the energy front as well. It's important to remember that not every blockchain is going to use the same underlying technology as Bitcoin and use Bitcoin's proof of work chain. So they're not all going to have the same power needs. But more importantly, it's important to remember that these aren't wasted power resources. This is displacing power resources used in other areas. So just to use the example of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency versus banks, for thousands of years, people have kept money in banks, and banks have been built to be huge, ominous structures. Modern banks today, in my age, are big concrete buildings, and that's done so that people can feel safe about the money inside. It's easy to forget the enormous amount of carbon that's produced to produce the cement and the concrete and the building materials for these huge structures just to store money inside. Once we stop needing huge structures for some of these things, the environmental savings are immense. We have to think about the technologies we're displacing and the savings we create, as well as what we spend with the new technologies that we're trying to use.
Some really interesting and fascinating information you mentioned just there. So, Edward, Jason, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having both of you on the line today to give us your expert opinion on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leah.
Absolutely. And that is all from our new On The Block panel today. I'm Leah Heilpen, and you can get in touch with us on social media at Blocks Live TV to give us your thoughts on today's biggest stories. But for now, back to you, Jessica.